Welcome to another deep dive. Today, our mission is to explore what I can only describe as a really profound, incredibly raw internal reckoning. And this is happening right now within the American Muslim community.
It really is. It's a heavy topic.
Yeah, definitely. We're going to be unpacking this deeply reflective, frankly provocative piece of writing. It's titled Unchaining the Soul, The Quest for an American Islam. And the goal here is to explore this tension between a theology that is fundamentally about profound peace and the reality of extremist violence.
Right. And tracking this multi-generational quest to build, a truly indigenous American Islamic identity, which is not an easy process.
Not at all. And to give you, the listener, some context on our source material today, the author is a really prominent Muslim scholar. He actually founded the East-West Foundation.
Yeah, he spent, 2 decades in the trenches building interfaith bridges.
Exactly. And he even served in the U.S. government after 9/11. So he's looking at his own community from a place of deep love, really. But he's asking some very hard, very painful questions.
He is. And, before we go any further, we really need to establish some ground rules for today's deep dive.
Right. The disclaimer.
Yes, the mandatory impartiality statement.
Right.
We have to make something explicitly clear to you, our listener. The source material we're mapping out today, it touches on some of the most highly charged geopolitical and political issues of our time.
Absolutely.
We're going to be discussing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, terrorism, domestic politics, U.S. military policies, all as they are framed within this specific essay.
And we want to state up front, in no uncertain terms, that we are taking absolutely no sides here.
None.
We're not endorsing any viewpoints, left-wing, right-wing, pro-this or anti-that. Our only job today is to impartially map out the author's arguments, his historical analysis, his internal community critiques, exactly as he presents them in the text.
Right. We're essentially just holding up a mirror to his perspective so you can understand his unique vantage point. We're not here to tell you what to think about global politics.
Definitely not. We're just the guides to the text. We're here to help you see the architecture of his argument.
Exactly.
So with that mission established, I kind of want to start by painting a picture for you, because there's this incredibly evocative image in the Islamic tradition. It's a widely authenticated hadith that, from what the author says, pretty much every Muslim child learns about the month of Ramadan.
Yeah, and the imagery is just intensely physical.
It really is. It says that when Ramadan begins, the gates of heaven are thrown wide open, the gates of hell are slammed shut, and the devils, like the actual literal forces of evil, are physically chained up.
It's a fascinating theological concept, right? Because it's not presented as just a metaphor for trying to be a better person during a holiday.
Right.
It's presented as a literal shift in the cosmic architecture. The idea is that the universe itself is bending to facilitate human goodness for these 30 days.
It's this profound promise of a designated protected peace, like a time when the human soul is supposed to have this unusual, unencumbered clarity because the darkness is, by divine decree, locked away.
And that promise is deepened even further by the 97th chapter of the Quran, Surah Al-Qadr.
Oh, the night of power.
Exactly. Which is traditionally observed during the final 10 days of Ramadan. The text says this one night is better than 1,000 months, angels descend to the earth, and the chapter ends with this singular, luminous guarantee. It says, peace it is until the rising of the dawn.
Peace it is until the rising of the dawn. I mean, just hold that phrase in your mind, because the author uses that exact promise to set up the central, really agonizing paradox of his whole essay.
Yeah, this is where it gets heavy.
You have this guarantee of cosmic peace, but then you step into the reality of March 2026. Right in the middle of those final, holiest 10 days of Ramadan, when millions of American Muslims are seeking that exact promised stillness, the peace is just completely shattered.
Shattered by a string of 3 horrific violent attacks.
Right. Committed by Muslim men within a single week, right here in America. Which forces a truly agonizing, almost unthinkable internal question for that community.
And it's the question that drives this entire text. What happens when the darkness persists and violence erupts during the very month when the chains are supposed to hold?
Exactly. The author sets up this really jarring split-screen reality. On one side of the screen, you have the profound quiet of a community, fasting and praying. On the other side, you have the chaotic, violent noise of these distinct motivational profiles.
And we really need to look at these 3 attacks because the author uses them as the catalyst for his entire critique.
Let's walk through them, starting with March 7th in New York City.
Right. So on March 7th, you have 2 teenagers, Emir Balat, who was 18, and Ibrahim Qayyumi, 19. They drive from Bucks County, Pennsylvania to Manhattan.
And they have homemade bombs, right?
Yeah, packed with TATP explosives, nuts and bolts.
Man.
And their target is a crowd outside Gracie Mansion.
Which is incredibly specific because they were targeting the official residence of Zohran Mamdani, who had just been elected as the first Muslim mayor of New York City.
The context of the crowd is also crucial here. There was an anti-Islam protest happening outside the mansion.
Oh, organized by Jake Lang.
Exactly. The text notes Lang is a pardoned January 6th rioter with a well-documented history of extreme anti-Muslim and anti-Semitic provocations. So that protest naturally drew a counter-demonstration. You have a highly volatile mix of people outside the mayor's residence.
And these teenagers intended to throw their bombs into that crowd.
Right. But the bombs malfunctioned.
Thank God. I mean, the devices failed to detonate properly, but when the FBI arrested them, both teens waived their Miranda rights and proudly declared allegiance to ISIS.
One of them actually told investigators he wanted an event bigger than the Boston Marathon bombing.
Just chilling. But what the author finds so deeply disturbing here is the target selection. This wasn't just an attack on a random crowd.
No, you have ISIS-inspired teenagers targeting the home of America's first Muslim mayor during the holiest month of the Islamic calendar.
The author describes this as a very specific kind of intracommunal horror. It's like the extremist fringe of the religion violently attacking the very concept, the very possibility of Muslim civic leadership and integration in America.
It's literally an attack on their own representation.
Like they're saying, your success in the American system is a betrayal to our ideology, so we're going to kill you for it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then, just 5 days later, on March 12th, the motivation for violence completely shifts. We go to West Bloomfield, Michigan.
Right, Ayman Mohammed Ghazali.
Yes, a 41-year-old naturalized citizen from Lebanon. He rams his truck through the front doors of Temple Israel, which is one of the largest Reform synagogues in the country.
And his vehicle was loaded with gasoline and commercial fireworks, right?
Yeah, he fired a rifle through his windshield and then took his own life as the truck burned in the hallway of the synagogue.
And the detail that just, I mean, it stops your heart. There were 140 children inside the building's early childhood center at that exact moment.
By some absolute miracle, all 140 children survived. One security guard was injured. But when we look at the motive, as outlined in the text, it's entirely different from the New York teenagers.
Right, he wasn't ISIS.
No, Ghazali was not acting on a directive from ISIS. He was acting out of profound, grief-driven vengeance. His two brothers had been killed just days earlier in an Israeli airstrike in Lebanon.
Which the text links to the broader geopolitical conflict with Hezbollah.
Exactly. He took his geopolitical grief and violently projected it onto American Jews.
And then on that exact same morning, March 12th, we have the third attack down in Norfolk, Virginia.
Mohammed Baylor Jallow.
Yeah, 36-year-old Army veteran. He walks into an ROTC classroom at Old Dominion University, and he explicitly asks twice if it is an ROTC class.
Then he shouts Allahu Akbar and opens fire.
He murdered Lieutenant Colonel Brandon Shaw, who was a decorated officer. I think he had flown helicopters over Iraq and Afghanistan.
He had. And Jallow wounded 2 cadets before the students managed to subdue and kill him. And again, Jallow's profile is entirely distinct.
Because he was a convicted ISIS supporter who had just been released from federal prison, 3 months prior?
Right. This is a case of jihadist recidivism, specifically targeting the American military apparatus.
So think about what we just laid out for you. Think about looking at this split screen. It's deeply disorienting.
It really is.
You have a holy month dedicated to cosmic peace, interrupted by ISIS ideology targeting a Muslim mayor, Hezbollah-linked geopolitical grief targeting an American synagogue, and violent jihadist recidivism targeting the American military.
And if you're sitting in a mosque leadership meeting trying to make sense of this, how on earth do you process it? How do you grapple with the fact that your own faith is being weaponized in 3 completely different ways in a single week?
Well, the author points out that the immediate instinct for many in the community is to point to statistics.
And he actually validates that instinct, right?
Yeah.
He establishes a vital statistical baseline in his essay. He says unequivocally that the overwhelming majority of American Muslims, over 99.99% of the roughly 3.5 million co-religionists in America, are peaceful, law-abiding citizens.
Right. He makes the point that America has many forms of violence. We have school shootings, white supremacist massacres. No single religious or ethnic community owns the phenomenon of American violence.
Right. He isn't saying Muslims are uniquely violent, but he is saying that these specific attacks, in their variety and their timing, highlight a unique failure.
And that's where his thesis pivots. He asks, if these acts represent a statistically microscopic fraction of the community, why are they happening at all?
His argument is that these three men represent a massive, glaring institutional deficit. They're symptoms of a community infrastructure that is failing to address the tiny yet lethal fraction of people who are falling through the cracks of identity formation.
Okay, so if the institutions are failing these vulnerable individuals, we have to ask, what exactly is the nature of that failure? And that brings us to the author's critique of how the major American Muslim organizations have historically responded to these exact types of crises.
To understand that critique, we have to look at how these institutions were built in the first place. Over the past 4 decades, major Muslim organizations were constructed. Groups like ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America,
KR, the Council on American Islamic Relations.
and MPAC, the Muslim Public Affairs Council. And the author points out a really fascinating sociological parallel here. They were consciously modeled after American Jewish institutions.
Right. The text quotes Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, noting the direct parallels. Like the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee mirrors the Anti-Defamation League, the ADO.
ISNA parallels the Union for Reform Judaism. AR echoes the American Jewish Committee.
They looked at a minority religious group that had successfully integrated into America and built incredible civil rights infrastructure, and they basically copied the blueprint.
They did. And the author acknowledges they've done critical, necessary work defending civil rights, fighting workplace discrimination, combating bigotry. But his critique is that because they were built primarily as civil rights and political advocacy organizations, their response to internal crises has calcified.
Right. Specifically regarding violence committed by Muslims, it's turned into a rigid, predictable playbook. He calls it the distance, deflect, defend formula.
Distance, deflect, defend.
When I read that, I instantly thought of corporate PR crisis management. I mean, think about the last time you saw a massive corporate brand deal with a scandal where a rogue employee did something terrible.
I would absolutely see the exact same playbook.
Right. Step 1, distance. This person does not represent our company's values. Or in this case, this act does not represent Islam.
Step 2, deflect. Look at these other external factors that caused this. In the corporate world, it's a failure of a third-party vendor. In this context, it's American foreign policy or systemic Islamophobia.
And then step 3, defend. Our core brand, our religion, is fundamentally one of peace.
It is exactly a PR strategy. And the author is very careful to note that each of these 3 steps contains a kernel of objective truth.
Right. Islam is a religion of peace to its adherents.
Aggressive foreign policy does impact radicalization cycles, and terrorists do not represent the majority. But his profound critique is that when you rely solely on a PR playbook, you're evading the deeper theological reckoning required. You are treating a spiritual crisis like a public relations problem.
And that's exactly where I wanted to push back while reading. I mean, doesn't a religion require deeper soul searching than a PR playbook? You can protect a corporate brand with a well-timed press release, but you can't protect a human soul that way.
Precisely.
If a teenager is being radicalized online, a press release distancing the community from his actions doesn't actually solve the spiritual void that led him there in the first place.
It doesn't. And this is where the author draws a really poignant, albeit uncomfortable, parallel between the Muslim experience post-9/11 and the Jewish experience post-October 7th.
Oh, this part was fascinating.
He argues that October 7th did for American Jews what 9/11 did for American Muslims. It cracked open a crisis of identity and exposed institutional inadequacies. He argues that in both communities, there was a historical overinvestment in universal public engagement.
Like, they got really good at speaking the language of universal human rights, civil advocacy, and political mobilization.
Yes, but in doing so, they neglected the particular. They focused so much on how they related to the outside world that they forgot to nurture their own internal ecosystem.
They neglected the deeper work of cultivating a particularistic, spiritually grounded, civically rooted religious identity.
The author essentially says that when you spend all your energy defending the fortress from the outside, you forget to tend the garden on the inside.
Defending the fortress while neglecting the garden, that is a perfect way to conceptualize it. But the decay in the garden isn't just about PR. The text brings in another scholar, Khaled Abu el-Fadl, who diagnoses this internal decay as a crisis of authority.
A crisis of authority, yeah.
What exactly is the mechanism of that crisis? Like, how does authority break down in this context?
Well, Abu el-Fadl points to a dangerous gap in modern Islamic discourse that fundamentally alters how the religion is understood by its own followers. To understand this, we need to look at classical Islamic thought, which makes a sharp distinction between two concepts, Sharia and fiqh.
Okay, unpack that for us.
So Sharia is understood as the divine, perfect, unalterable law of God. Fiqh, on the other hand, is human jurisprudence. It is the fallible, constantly evolving human attempt to understand and apply that divine law to daily life.
Okay, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. Is it kind of like the difference between the abstract concept of justice and the actual American legal code?
Oh, that's an excellent analogy, yes.
Yes. Like, justice is this perfect divine ideal we all strive for, but the legal code is just a bunch of flawed humans trying to write rules to get us as close to that ideal as possible. And sometimes the legal code gets it wrong.
Exactly. But Abu el-Fadl argues that modern Islam has been flooded with self-declared experts, internet clerics, and political activists who blur this crucial line. They present their flawed human rulebook, their fiqh, as if it is the flawless divine concept of sharia.
Right. They substitute shallow apologetics and political sloganeering for rigorous classical engagement.
And his devastating critique is about scale.
The scale of the information ecosystem.
Exactly. He says you can publish 100 rigorous, nuanced academic works from a small Muslim press explaining these classical distinctions, but it won't shape public understanding the way a single mass-market book from a major publisher can.
Or the way a viral TikTok from an extremist preacher can.
Right. The scale of their intellectual production simply does not match the scale of the ideological crisis they're facing.
So you have a PR-focused institutional leadership and a fragmented, easily manipulated theological authority where literally anyone with a microphone can claim to speak for God.
It's a dangerous combination.
Very. And if we want to understand why the institutions default to this, we have to look at who built them in the first place, and perhaps more importantly, who got left behind when they were being built.
Yes, and this takes us to a really eye-opening part of the text about the history of Islam in America, which honestly I think most people just don't know.
It is a critical piece of the puzzle. To explore this, the author leans heavily on the work of scholar Sherman Jackson, specifically his book, Islam and the Black American.
Right. Jackson outlines a history that subverts the common American narrative. Prior to the mid-20th century, Islam in America was not primarily an immigrant religion. It was overwhelmingly dominated by an indigenous Black American presence.
We are talking about a deeply rooted American tradition, and Jackson describes this early American Islam as being rooted in Black religion, which he defines as a God-centered protest against racial injustice.
It wasn't an imported theology. It was a theology forged in the crucible of the American experience, dealing with American problems.
But then comes 1965, specifically the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act.
Which fundamentally changed the demographics of the United States.
Right. It lifted the old national origin quotas that heavily favored Northern Europe, and it led to a massive wave of immigrant Muslims arriving from the Middle East, South Asia, and elsewhere.
And according to Jackson, this new wave of immigrants essentially executed a hostile takeover of the narrative. They assumed a monopoly over what constituted proper or authentic Islam in America.
Because they came from the quote-unquote Muslim world, they brought the Arabic language, they brought cultural authority, and they marginalized the indigenous Black Muslims who had been practicing and building Islam in America for decades.
The quote Jackson uses to describe this dynamic is just, it's gut-wrenching. He writes that Black American converts had simply moved from the back of the bus to the back of the camel.
Wow, from the back of the bus to the back of the camel. I mean, it implies that they escaped white American racial hierarchy only to find themselves subjected to an imported religious hierarchy, where they were once again relegated to the bottom, viewed as less authentic by the new arrivals.
It captures a profound structural injustice. But the author goes further to explain how this demographic shift was so damaging to the creation of a healthy American Islam. These immigrant institutions didn't just bring people, they brought ideological and political baggage.
Right, the text mentions the Muslim Brotherhood, Jamaat Islami, and various forms of Salafism. But let's pause here.
Okay.
Because for someone who only hears those terms on the evening news, what is the actual theological mechanism there? Why do those specific schools of thought make it harder to build a thriving community in Michigan or Virginia?
To understand this, we have to define those terms. Salafism, broadly speaking, is a movement that seeks to return to what it considers the pure, unadulterated practices of the earliest generations of Muslims. It tends to be highly literalist, very rigid, and deeply suspicious of cultural adaptation.
And the others?
The Muslim Brotherhood and Jamaat Islami emerged in the 20th century in Egypt and South Asia, respectively. primarily as anti-colonial movements. They were inherently political. They were formed as resistance movements against British and Western imperialism.
So their defining characteristic, their origin story, is rooted in viewing the West as the ultimate civilizational nemesis.
Precisely. If your entire religious framework is built on resisting Western imperialism, you are going to struggle to build a thriving, integrated religious life inside the West.
By sidelining the Black American Muslim tradition, which, as Jackson points out, was already Western, already American, and built to engage with America's unfulfilled promises, the immigrant institutions essentially threw away the very blueprint they needed to survive and thrive here.
They imported an opposition-based theology instead of utilizing an integration-based theology.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here for a second, though. Were these immigrant communities intentionally trying to marginalize Black Americans, or were they just in survival mode? I mean, think about it. You move to a new country, you face discrimination, you don't speak the language perfectly, you naturally cling to the familiar.
That's very true.
You build institutions that look and sound like home. Is it possible it was less of a malicious, calculated takeover and more of a tragic sociological collision?
That's a very fair distinction, and sociology certainly plays a huge role. It's entirely natural for immigrant groups to insulate. You see it in Little Italy, you see it in Koreatown, but the result is what the author was critiquing.
Right.
Whether the marginalization was intentional or accidental, the result was an American Islam that became defined more by imported political ideology than by civilizational ethics.
It created this bizarre irony where you have institutions living in the West, benefiting from the West, raising their children in the West, but harboring a theology that is fundamentally suspicious of, or even anti, the West.
It's an unsustainable contradiction. You can't build a healthy home if you fundamentally believe the ground it's built on is your enemy.
And this sidelining of the indigenous history didn't just marginalize people. According to the text, it marginalized a crucial theological tool. It hollowed out the spiritual core of the faith.
Yes, the author argues that mainstream institutional life began to heavily favor legalism over mysticism. It became all about the rules, what is halal, what is haram, maintaining political solidarity, and defending the borders of the identity.
What was lost was the older tradition of cultivating the self toward moral perfection.
The tradition of Ihsan. The text talks extensively about Sufism here.
Now, I have to admit, when I hear Sufism, my mind immediately goes to whirling dervishes and poetry by Rumi. It feels very, I don't know, aesthetic, like the artistic wing of the religion. But the author is talking about it as a structural necessity, right?
He is, and he does acknowledge the danger of how Sufism is perceived in the West. He cites scholar Omid Safi, who warned against the weaponization of Sufism by Western think tanks, specifically mentioning the Rand Corporation.
Why would a think tank care about Sufism?
The idea was that Western governments, during the War on Terror, wanted to cynically promote moderate poetry-reading Sufis as a counterweight to dangerous legalists. They wanted to domesticate the religion to serve American foreign policy.
Which is incredibly patronizing. It treats a deep spiritual tradition like a geopolitical pacifier.
Highly patronizing. But Safi and the author both clarify that Sufism isn't some separate mystical sect you can just carve out and use for PR. Until the middle of the 19th century, Sufism was the mainstream devotional life of the majority of the world's Muslims.
Wow, the majority.
Yes, is the beating heart of Islamic civilization. It is the rigorous discipline of purifying the ego, the nafs.
Okay, but I want to push back on this because I want to understand the actual mechanism here. I hear that purifying the ego sounds great, but practically speaking, how does reading mystical poetry or meditating stop a teenager from being radicalized by a slick ISIS video on TikTok? That feels a bit idealistic. What is the actual link there?
Think of it as the psychological immune system. The author paints a picture of a young person who is educated in this deeply rooted civilizational Islam, say the Zanzibari Khoja or Punjabi traditions, which are historically very pluralistic.
Yeah.
This young person is taught from childhood that the ultimate spiritual battle is not against an external political enemy. The ultimate battle is against their own arrogance, their own greed, their own ego. They internalize the Quranic idea that God created humanity in diverse nations and tribes, specifically so that you may know one another.
That's Quran 49.13, right? To know one another, not to conquer one another.
Exactly. If your entire religious education is fundamentally about humbling your ego and seeking divine love and diverse humanity, your psychological immune system is robust. When ISIS comes along with their slick, nihilistic, simple-minded propaganda that says, here's a gun, here's the enemy, kill them and go to heaven, your spiritual immune system rejects it.
Because it looks spiritually shallow and grotesque to you.
Right. But if your Islamic education was nothing but political grievance, rigid black and white rules, and anger at the West,
Then you have a void. And the violent propaganda fills that void perfectly. It gives you a sense of cosmic importance without requiring any actual internal spiritual work. You don't have to fix your flaws, you just have to attack the enemy.
exactly.
So if his mystical center was lost in the mainstream, were there any movements trying to keep an indigenous, spiritually grounded American theology alive?
The author identifies 3 peripheral movements that offer genuine resources for this kind of grounded theology, but notes that all 3 were sidelined by the mainstream for different reasons. First, there was Warith Deen Muhammad's movement.
Right, he was the son of Elijah Muhammad.
Yes, and he famously transitioned the Nation of Islam toward mainstream Sunni orthodoxy. He essentially tried to synthesize the Black American indigenous experience with classical Islam, offering a truly American theological language.
But the text notes that his movement largely fragmented after his death in 2008, losing much of its institutional momentum.
Correct. Second is the Ahmadiyya community. They have been in America for a century. Their motto is literally love for all, hatred for none.
That sounds perfectly aligned with what the author is calling for.
It is. They are deeply civically engaged. They run hospitals. They emphasize peace. But they are rejected by the vast majority of Sunni Muslims because of their founders' messianic claims. They are considered heretical by the mainstream, so their model of integration is ignored.
And the third?
The Hizmet movement, inspired by Turkish scholar Fethullah Gulen. This is a movement focused heavily on education, working within democratic institutions, and robust interfaith dialogue.
But they were sidelined too.
Yes, it operates in a parallel lane rather than integrating fully into American Muslim life, largely because it has a very specific Turkish ethnocultural character, and more recently because it has been consumed by the political persecution it faces from the government in Ankara.
So you have these 3 distinct models, one Black American, one Messianic pacifist, one Turkish educational, all of which possess vital pieces of the puzzle for building a healthy American Islam. But they are all marginalized. So the mainstream is left without this ego-purifying spirituality. And what fills that void for the next generation? According to the author, the void is filled by geopolitical grievance.
And this brings us to what the author calls one of the most sensitive yet critical dynamics in contemporary American Muslim life.
And listener, this is where we want to remind you of our impartiality pledge. We are going to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as it is framed in the text, analyzing the author's critique of how it functions within his own community.
Right. We are not making value judgments on the conflict itself, but rather exploring the sociological impact it has on American Muslims, as argued by the source.
Yes. The author is careful to state clearly that the suffering of Palestinians is real, and the destruction in Gaza since October 7, 2023 has been catastrophic.
He also states unequivocally that anti-Semitic violence is unacceptable, and that American Jews are not responsible for the actions of the Israeli government, just as American Muslims are not responsible for foreign terrorists.
But his core critique is about identity formation. He argues that Palestine solidarity has mutated. It has shifted from being a legitimate, urgent political cause into something approaching an article of faith.
He cites a stunning statistic to back this up. 61% of Muslim voters in swing states name Gaza as their top priority, above healthcare, above the economy, above local schooling.
He argues that something breaks in a religious tradition when political solidarity displaces theology, ethics, and spiritual formation as the primary marker of what it means to belong to the religion.
He quotes scholar Tom Fitchine, who observes that some of the most famous spokespeople for Palestine use a purely secular framing, language of decolonization, intersectionality, and Marxism, and that actually supersedes Islamic sentiment.
And he also brings in Einat Wilf, an Israeli writer. Now, even though she writes from a completely different vantage point, the author finds her observation about semantic manipulation crucial.
Semantic manipulation is the idea that words can be emptied of their original meaning and weaponized for a new purpose.
And the author believes American Muslims are practicing this when they hollow out the rich, complex language of Islamic ethics and replace it entirely with the vocabulary of political mobilization.
Because the cost of this displacement is massive. If you define a religious tradition primarily through geopolitical opposition to something happening thousands of miles away, rather than by a moral vision for human flourishing where you actually live, you cannot build a sustainable future.
Right. You fail to answer the critical questions for the next generation. Like, what is our ethical contribution to America? How do we build resilience against extremism? How do we interact with our neighbors?
It goes right back to Sherman Jackson's warning. If your primary identity is anti-Western, you are fundamentally alienating yourself from your own home.
And there is perhaps no arena where this tension between being an American citizen and harboring an anti-Western grievance is more dramatically and tragically unresolved than in the military.
This is a profound and uncomfortable contradiction the author highlights. The United States is a nation that projects military power globally. That is an inherent dimension of American identity.
And American Muslims are part of that apparatus. There are over 5,800 self-identified Muslims currently serving in the U.S. military.
And the text points out, this isn't some post-9/11 attempt to prove loyalty. This is a deep tradition. Scholar Edward Curtis has documented Muslim military service in America, stretching all the way back to the Revolutionary War.
The author brings up Captain Humayun Khan, the Muslim-American soldier who sacrificed his life in Iraq to save his men. His parents were so movingly honored at the 2016 Democratic National Convention.
That represents a deep, honorable tradition of service. And yet, the author points out that the dominant discourse within American Muslim institutions largely treats American military engagement as something to be either opposed, evaded, or quietly endured.
It's almost never theologically engaged. There is no robust intellectual framework provided for a Muslim who wants to serve their country.
And that theological gap is a canyon that people fall into. That is exactly the gap that Mohammed Baylor Jallow, the third attacker from March 2026, fell through.
Think about his profile. He was a veteran, he enlisted, he served honorably. But because there was no robust theological framework in his community to help him reconcile his faith with his service, he was incredibly vulnerable.
He went online, found the radical black and white lectures of Anwar al-Awlaki, and was essentially brainwashed into believing his service was a betrayal of God.
The author also links this to the tragic 2009 Fort Hood shooting, where Major Nadal Hassan explicitly concluded that he could not balance being a Muslim with his obligations as an American military officer.
The failure of institutions to provide a theological framework for citizenship in a powerful nation-state has lethal consequences. When the community doesn't answer the question of how to serve, the extremists answer it for them.
So the question isn't whether Muslims have to become uncritical warmongers to be good Americans. It's whether they can develop a sophisticated way to handle the moral complexities of citizenship. And the author offers an incredible historical analogy here: the Quakers, the Society of Friends.
This is perhaps the most instructive parallel in the entire text regarding how to handle this tension.
Right. Because the Quakers have maintained an absolute uncompromising peace testimony since 1660. They are deeply theologically anti-war. They will not fight.
And yet, nobody questions their Americanness.
Exactly. They founded the state of Pennsylvania. They were the engine behind the Underground Railroad. The American Friends Service Committee won the Nobel Peace Prize for doing global humanitarian work.
The Quaker model proves that you can have an anti-war conviction and still possess deep, undeniable civic belonging. They are not mutually exclusive. But, and this is the author's crucial point, reconciling those two things requires massive institutional infrastructure, incredible moral imagination, and generations of hard intellectual labor.
The Quakers didn't just protest, they built alternative ways to serve the nation.
The Quakers did the work. American Islam, the author argues, has not done the work yet. As he puts it, you can be anti-war and deeply American, like the Amish or mainline Protestants, but you cannot be vaguely anti-American and expect to build a sustainable religious community on American soil.
So this leads us directly to the author's proposed solution. If the current trajectory is unsustainable, if the PR playbook is failing, what is the blueprint? He calls his solution covenantal pluralism.
Covenantal pluralism.
Ah.
It sounds very academic, but it's actually rooted in some ancient, fundamental Abrahamic history.
Right. He is arguing that Muslims don't need to import Western liberal values to figure out how to live in a diverse society. The tools are already inside their own tradition.
He starts with the Hebrew Brit, the concept of the covenant. God made a covenant with all humanity through Noah, and specifically with the Jewish people through Abraham and Moses. This establishes the theological precedent that a relationship with the divine is not exclusive to one single community.
Pluralism is baked into the monotheistic DNA from the start, but he also brings up a specific Islamic historical event, the Medinan Mithaq.
The Constitution of Medina, drafted by the Prophet Muhammad, in 622 CE. This is a foundational document that is often overlooked in modern political discourse.
Tell us about that.
When the Prophet migrated to Medina, he didn't create a theocratic ethno-state exclusively for Muslims. He drafted a political constitution that united Muslims, Jewish tribes, Christians, and pagan tribes into a single political community. They shared mutual defense obligations while maintaining their own religious autonomy and legal systems.
So pluralism was literally the Prophet's own political innovation. It wasn't forced on him by a modern UN mandate or Western pressure. It was his idea.
Exactly.
And the author connects this back to that Quranic verse we mentioned earlier, 49.13, where God says, "We created you from a single pair of male and female, and made you into nations and tribes that you may know one another." Pluralism is a divine mandate, not a reluctant afterthought.
To operationalize this today, the author brings back Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, who talks about the concept of nativisation.
I love this concept, trimming the sociological edges while keeping the theological core.
Right. Rauf points out that Islam has done this successfully all over the world. As Islam migrated out of the Arabian Peninsula over the centuries, it underwent a transformative fitting in. It became culturally Senegalese or Turkish or Indonesian or Chinese.
The core theology, the belief in one God, the daily prayers, that remains pristine. But the sociological expression, the architecture, the clothing, the cultural idioms, that adapts to the soil it's planted in.
So the goal isn't a Protestant-style Reformation where you throw out the tradition. It's an Americanization. It's allowing the tree to grow in American soil.
And to understand how long this takes, the author lays out a really fascinating timeline comparison between American Judaism and American Islam. And listener, I want you to really pay attention to the dates here because it completely reframes the scale of the challenge.
Let's look at the Jewish timeline first. The major waves of Eastern European Jewish immigration to America began in the late 19th century, around the 1880s.
Right.
This was a volatile time. You had massive immigrant populations trying to figure out how to be Jewish in a rapidly industrializing Protestant majority nation. Barely a generation later, in 1885, you have the Pittsburgh Platform.
Walk us through the Pittsburgh Platform. Why was that such a big deal?
It was a landmark document where American Reform rabbis formally articulated a distinctly American theology. They explicitly differentiated the enduring ethical core of Judaism, the moral laws, from the political or geographic laws of the ancient past, like dietary restrictions or priestly purity laws, which they argued were no longer applicable in the modern era.
Okay, wow.
Then, in 1902, Solomon Schechter reorganized the Jewish Theological Seminary, creating a robust pipeline for American-trained religious leaders. In 1913, the Anti-Defamation League was founded. By 1955, when the famous book Protestant Catholic Jew was published, Judaism was fully institutionally integrated into the American civil religion.
So that process, from the arrival of the major immigrant wave to full institutional maturity, where they had their own seminaries, their own theological platforms, and unquestioned civic belonging, took roughly 120 years.
Yes.
Now let's look at the Islamic timeline. The major wave of Muslim immigration didn't start until after the 1965 Immigration Act. So we were only about 60 years into that journey.
Exactly. They're basically only halfway through the biological timeline of integration.
And you can see the delay in the institutions. The author points out that America's first accredited Islamic seminary, Zaytuna College, wasn't founded until 2009. Compare that to the Jewish equivalent, Hebrew Union College, which was founded in 1875.
American Muslims have ISNA, founded in 1982, but they have absolutely no equivalent to the Pittsburgh Platform.
Right. There has been no formal, agreed-upon theological declaration by mainstream leadership that says, here is what is eternally Islamic, and here is what is just Middle Eastern or South Asian politics or cultural baggage.
There is no denominational creativity yet. Judaism developed Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist branches, each representing a different, thoughtful negotiation between ancient tradition and American modernity. American Islam doesn't have those formal pipelines yet.
But the author is very fair here. He doesn't just blame the community. He points out 5 massive structural complications that make this process so much harder for American Muslims than it was for American Jews. We should go through these deeply because they explain why it's taking so long. Let's start with the first one, extreme racial diversity.
Yes, there is no racial majority among American Muslims. You have roughly equal proportions of white, black, Asian, and Arab-identified members. Think about the logistical and cultural challenge of that.
It's staggering.
If you were building a synagogue in 1900, mostly everyone speaks Yiddish or German and comes from a similar European background. If you are building a mosque in 2026, you might have congregants who speak Arabic, Urdu, Somali, and English, all with vastly different cultural expectations of what a religious service should look like.
Building a unified identity across that level of racial and linguistic diversity is incredibly complex. It's like trying to build an airplane while you are also trying to invent a common language for the mechanics.
Which leads to the second complication, the pre-existing black indigenous tension, which we discussed earlier with Sherman Jackson.
Exactly. Judaism didn't have a massive pre-existing indigenous American population that clashed with the new immigrants in the same way. The collision between immigrant assumptions of authority and Black American indigenous traditions created a profound internal fracture that still hasn't healed.
The third complication is massive, the post-9/11 security state. The development of Muslim institutions was profoundly distorted by the war on terror. How exactly did that warp the timeline?
It forced the community into a defensive crouch during its most critical developmental phase. Just as they needed to be having robust, open theological debates, mosques were being surveilled by informants.
Charities were shut down or prosecuted under material support laws. An entire community was placed under a cloud of suspicion. People became afraid to debate controversial topics out loud for fear of government reprisal.
The author notes that while early 20th century anti-Semitism is an instructive comparison, the apparatus of the post-9/11 national security state applied pressures and surveillance that have no precise parallel in Jewish American history.
It's hard to have a vulnerable internal reckoning when you know the FBI might be listening in the back row.
Definitely. The fourth complication is something I find fascinating, the lack of centralized ordination.
Right. Unlike the Catholic Church, where the Vatican can defrock a rogue priest, Sunni Islam has no central authority. It doesn't have a centralized rabbinical system like the ones that emerged in American Judaism.
So if a guy in a basement in Virginia declares himself an imam, sets up a YouTube channel, and starts preaching a highly politicized, extremist interpretation of the faith, there is no structural mechanism to revoke his credentials. How does a community build a unified, moderate American identity when literally anyone can claim to speak for the religion?
They can't. Not without building new institutions of peer review and accreditation, which is exactly what the author is calling for.
And finally, the fifth complication, geopolitical entanglements. From the war on terror to the current conflicts in the Middle East, the external pressures on American Muslim identity are intense.
Again, the author compares this to the pressure Zionism, the founding of Israel, placed on Jewish identity, but notes the modern Muslim context is qualitatively different. It's highly fragmented, involving multiple state actors and proxy wars, making it almost impossible to detach American religious life from global headlines.
So if you take a step back and look at this logically, despite all these massive complications, the racial divides, the surveillance, the lack of hierarchy, the basic biological timeline of a religion taking root in new soil still holds true. They are, as the author says, simply behind schedule.
But the tragedy is that the cost of that delay isn't just academic.
Exactly. The cost of that delay is measured in the bloodshed in March 2026. Every year, without this infrastructure, leaves another teenager like Mir Balat or another veteran like Baylor Jallo vulnerable to the void. The attacks are the tragic symptoms of a community that hasn't finished its nativization process.
Which brings us to the urgent call to action. If the timeline is lagging, how do they catch up? What does the blueprint for the future actually look like?
The author lays out a very clear four-part blueprint. First, he says mosques have to fundamentally change their function. They can no longer just be ethnic prayer halls where people pop in, pray in Arabic, and leave.
Right, they have to become true community centers, places of worship, yes, but also centers for education, social service, mental health counseling, and active civic engagement. They need to be rooted in their local ZIP codes, not just in the old country.
Second, they need seminaries. They need institutions like Zaytuna College to multiply. They need to train religious leaders, imams, and chaplains who are deeply grounded in the classical Islamic tradition and fully fluent in the American context.
An imam needs to understand both the intricacies of fiqh and the realities of the American constitutional system.
Exactly. Third, philanthropic institutions must pivot. Money needs to shift. Right now, the author notes, so much funding goes toward political advocacy, anti-defamation work, and legal defense. While necessary, he argues philanthropy must prioritize funding scholarship, spiritual formation, youth programs, and interfaith partnerships.
They need to fund the garden, not just the fortress walls.
And fourth, intellectual infrastructure. The author proposes a new intellectual journal. He calls it Suf, which means scrolls or pages. He wants to create a dedicated space for rigorous, self-critical theological conversation.
He wants to move the debate off of fragmented, algorithm-driven social media and into a serious, dedicated forum where scholars can do the heavy lifting of defining American Islam.
It's all about building a foundation that can support a multicultural, intellectually robust American vision of Islam. And the timing of this is crucial because, as the author points out, the nation is preparing to celebrate its 250th anniversary in July 2026.
This is a pivotal moment. The author insists that American Muslims don't need to invent a new story for the 250th anniversary. They already have a profound, deeply American story to tell. They just have to claim it and elevate it over the noise of the extremists.
And the history is incredible. We're talking about Omar ibn Said, an enslaved African Muslim who was writing his autobiography in Arabic in North Carolina in the 1830s. We are talking about Bilali Muhammad, who maintained his Islamic practices on a plantation in Georgia, writing manuscripts on Islamic law while enslaved.
Fast forward to the 20th century. You have Abdullah Igram, an American veteran who successfully petitioned the Secretary of the Army and later President Eisenhower in 1953 to officially add Islam as a religious designation on military dog tags.
You have the Mother Mosque of America, built by immigrants in Cedar Rapids, Iowa in 1934.
These are not people who were fighting America. They were weaving themselves into its fabric. They were demanding that America live up to its own ideals of religious freedom.
And the author's plea to his community is this: show up to the 250th anniversary, not as supplicants asking for tolerance, and not as angry protesters demanding recognition, but as co-authors of the American experiment.
Show up and articulate how 14 centuries of Islamic civilizational ethics can actually contribute to the betterment of American democracy.
But that requires moving beyond the defensive crouch. It requires a willingness to do the hard, quiet, unglamorous internal work. It means elevating the spiritual depths of the tradition, the Sufi emphasis on purifying the self, the Quranic insistence on mercy over the thin, reactive religiosity that is defined only by what it opposes.
It's a daunting task. The author admits that when asked if American Islam is currently adequate to the demands of this moment, given the violence of March 2026, his honest answer is not yet.
But he is hopeful because the resources are already there, the tradition is deep enough, and the American experiment is flexible enough to hold this.
He changed his whole life's trajectory after 9/11 to do this work of translation between America and Islam. And 25 years later, those attacks showed him just how much work remains.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a thought experiment. Think about what we've discussed today regarding nativization, trimming the sociological edges while keeping the theological core. What if the ultimate success of an American religion isn't measured by how fiercely it defends itself from the outside culture?
That is the ultimate question of covenantal pluralism.
What if success is measured by what entirely new ethical vocabulary it contributes to that culture? If American Judaism gave us a profound framework for civil rights and social justice through the 20th century, and American Quakerism gave us a framework for pacifist civic action and abolition, what if American Islam's greatest gift to the 21st century hasn't even been articulated yet?
What if it's still waiting to be born from this exact crucible?
It's a powerful challenge to leave with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a really complex, heavy, but ultimately hopeful text. The author ends his essay by returning to that beautiful promise of Ramadan we started with, and it feels like the only right way for us to close today as well. Salamun hiya hatta matla'il fajr. Peace it is until the rising of the dawn. May we all build institutions worthy of that promise.